In this video, we'll discuss Texas independence, the election of 1840, and other issues surrounding the era. Americans, greedy for land, continued to covet the vast expanse of Texas, which the United States had abandoned to Spain when acquiring Florida in 1819. The Spanish authorities wanted to populate this unpeopled area, but then Mexico won its independence. A new regime in Mexico City thereupon concluded arrangements in 1823 for granting a huge tract of land to Stephen Austin, with the understanding that he would bring into Texas 300 American families, and they were to be of Roman Catholic faith. Two stipulations were largely ignored. Hardy Texas pioneers remained Americans at heart and did not become Americanized, as was requested by Mexico, and they resented the trammels imposed by a foreign government. They were especially annoyed by the presence of American soldiers. Energetic and prolific, Texas Americans numbered about 30,000 by 1835. Most of them were law-abiding, God-fearing people, but some of them had left the states only one or two chumps ahead of the sheriff, writing GTT, or Gone to Texas, on their doors. Among the adventurers who went to Texas were Davy Crockett, the famous rifleman, and Jim Bowie, the presumed inventor of the murderous knife that bears his name. A distinguished latecomer and leader was an ex-governor of Tennessee named Sam Houston. The pioneer individualists who came to Texas were not easy to push around. Friction rapidly increased between Mexicans and Texas over issues such as slavery, immigration, and local rights, and slavery was a particularly touchy topic. Mexico had emancipated its slaves in 1830 and prohibited further importation of slaves into Texas, as well as further colonization by troublesome Americans. When Stephen Austin went to Mexico City in 1833 to negotiate these differences with the Mexican government, the dictator Santa Anna clapped him in jail, and the explosion finally came out in 1835 when Santa Anna wiped out all local rights and began to raise an army. Early in 1836, the Texans declared their independence, unfurled their Lone Star flag, and named Sam Houston commander-in-chief. Santa Anna swept ferociously into Texas. Trapping a band of nearly 200 Texans at the Alamo in San Antonio, he wiped them out after a 13-day siege. Colonel W.B. Travis had declared, "I shall never surrender nor retreat, victory or death." A short time later, a band of 400 defeated American volunteers, having thrown down their arms at Goliad, were butchered as pirates. All these operations further delayed the Mexican advance and galvanized American opposition. Slain heroes like Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett, well known in life, became legendary in death, and Texan war cries swept up in the United States. General Sam Houston's small army retreated to the east, luring Santa Anna to San Jacinto, near Houston. The Mexicans numbered about 1,300, while the Texans about 900. Suddenly, on April 21, 1836, Houston turned, taking full advantage of the Mexican siesta. The Texans wiped out the pursuing force and captured Santa Anna. The dictator was forced to sign two treaties. By their terms, he agreed to withdraw Mexican troops and to recognize the Rio Grande as the extreme southwestern border of Texas, and when released, he tried to repudiate the agreement as illegal because he said that they forced him to do it. These events put the U.S. government in a sticky situation. The Texans could hardly have won their independence without the help of men and supplies from their American cousin. The Washington government, as the Mexicans bitterly complained, had a solemn obligation under international law to enforce its leaky neutrality statutes. But American public opinion, favorable to the Texans, openly nullified the existing legislation. The federal authorities were powerless to act, and President Jackson in 1837 extended the right hand of recognition to the Lone Star Republic. Many Texans wanted not just outright recognition of their independence, but an outright union with the United States. the radiant Texas bride, petitioned for annexation in 1837. Uncle Sam was jerked back by the hand of the slavery issue. Anti-slavery crusaders in the North were opposing annexation with increasing vehemence. They contended that the whole scheme was merely a conspiracy of Southern slaveocracy. At first glance, a slavery plot charge seemed plausible. Most of the early settlers in Texas, as well as American volunteers during the Revolution, had come from the states of the South and Southwest. But scholars have concluded that the settlement of Texas was merely the normal and inexorable march of the Western movement. Most of the immigrants came from the South and Southwest just because they were closer. And many Texans still were slaveholders, and admitting Texas would mean enlarging slavery. Martin Van Buren was renominated by the Democrats in 1840 without enthusiasm. The party had no acceptable alternative to what the Whigs called Martin Van Ruin. The Whigs, hungering from the spoils of office, learned from their mistakes in 1836 and united behind one candidate, Ohio's William Henry Harrison, who was not the ablest statesman, but he was believed to be the most able to go out and get votes. The aging hero, known for his successes against Indians and the British at the Battle of Tippecanoe and the Thames, Old Tippecanoe was nominated primarily because he was issueless and enemyless, which was a tested recipe for electoral success. John Tyler of Virginia was selected as vice president as his running mate. The Whigs published no official platform, hoping to sweep their hero into office with a frothy Huzzah for Harrison campaign, reminiscent of Jackson's triumph in 1828. A Democratic editor played directly into Whig hands, stupidly insulting the West. He lampooned Harrison as an impoverished old farmer who should be content with a pension, a log cabin, and a barrel of hard cider. Whigs adopted honest hard cider and sturdy log cabin as symbols for their campaign. Harrisonites portrayed him as the poor farmer of North Bend who had been called from his cabin to drive corrupt Jackson, spoilsman, from the presidential palace. They denounced Van Buren as supercilious and as aristocratic, and the Whig campaign was a master of the piece of inane hoopla. The log cabins were dished up in every conceivable form. And basically this system of campaign and banners and posters and paraphernalia is going to be very successful for the Whigs. In truth, Harrison was really from one of the first families of Virginia. He was not poverty-stricken, but he did live in a one-room log cabin, he did not live in a one-room log cabin, but he lived in a mansion, and he didn't drink hard cider, and he didn't plow his fields. But the details really didn't matter. He was portrayed, again, as someone who would identify with the common man. Harrison won by a surprisingly close margin in the popular vote, but by an overwhelming electoral margin of 234 to 60. Van Buren was washed out of Washington after serving only one term, and the Whig, William Henry Harrison, was ushered in. The election of 1840 conclusively demonstrated two major changes in American politics since the era of good feelings. The first was the triumph of a populist democratic style. Democracy had been something of a taint in the days of the lordly Federalists. But by 1840s, aristocracy was the taint, but democracy was respectable. Politicians were now forced to unbend and curry favor from the voting masses. In truth, most high political offices continued to be filled by leading citizens, but now these wealthy and prominent men had to forsake all social pretensions and cultivate the common torch if they hoped to win the presidential elections. The common man was at last moving to the center of the national political stage. Instead of the old divine right of kings, America was now bowing to the divine right of the people. The second dramatic change resulting from the 1840 election was the formation of the two-party system. The Jeffersonians had been so successful in absorbing the programs of their Federalist opponents that a full-blown two-party system had never truly emerged in the subsequent era of good feelings. The idea had prevailed that the parties of any sort smacked of conspiracy and faction and were injurious to the health of the body politic in a republic. By 1840, political parties had fully come of age, a lasting legacy of Andrew Jackson and his tenaciousness. Both national parties, the Democrats and the Whigs, grew out of the rich soil of Jeffersonian republicanism, and each laid claim to different aspects of Republican inheritance. Jacksonian Democrats glorified the liberty of the individual and were fiercely on guard against the inroads of privilege into government. Whigs trumpeted the national harmony of society, the value of community, and were willing to use government to realize their objectives. They also considered Jackson to be one of the leaders that they berated, one whose appeals to self-interest fostered conflict among individuals, classes, or sections. Democrats clung to states' rights and federal restraint in social and economic affairs as their basic doctrines, while the Whigs tended to favor a renewed national bank, protective tariff, internal improvements, public schools, and increasingly moral reforms, such as prohibition of liquor and eventually the abolition of slavery. The two parties were separated by real differences of philosophy and policy, but they had things in common as well. Both were mass party-based. Both tried deliberately to mobilize as many votes as possible for their cause. Most, for Democrats, tended to be humble folk, and for Whigs, tended to be more prosperous. But both parties commanded the loyalties of all types of Americans, from all social classes and all sections. The social diversity of the two parties fostered horse-creating compromises within each part that prevented them either from assuming extreme or radical positions. And by the same token, the geographical diversity of the two parties showed the emergence of purely sectional political parties and temporarily suppressed, through compromise, the issue of slavery. We'll continue to talk about the differences in the two-party system and the impact that they have on compromise and policies in the government in future classes.